Hello and welcome back to Historical Geology. This last video is on the origins of simple molecules, protobionts, which are molecules that simulate, that seem to replicate, that are sort of these baby steps into forming something that can maintain an energy level and be able to reproduce, which is essentially what life is. And those steps are called abiogenesis. Abiogenesis refers to the formation of an organic system, an organism, a cell, from inorganic parts, from raw chemical ingredients, the so-called primordial soup. When we look at the oldest fossils, we'll see your book talks about the apex chert in Australia, a marine rock, so obviously life formed in the ocean. It's about 3.5 billion years old, and there's definitely these microfossils of an organism. And then we talked about how those biomarkers in carbon, in the graphite, the carbon-12 preferred over carbon-13, in the 3.7 to 3.8 billion year old rocks in Greenland indicate that there was probably life around that time. And remember, 3.8 coincides with the end of that heavy, or that late heavy bombardment period, right? So life can now take a hold and begin to mutate, to have natural selection occur, and to evolve. So minimally, a living organism must reproduce and practice some kind of metabolism, right? So reproduction, metabolism. Reproduction ensures the long-term survival of the group, passing on that DNA, changes in that DNA in terms of mutations and the environment selecting adaptations or traits that are beneficial so that will ensure survival. And remember, this metabolism is you need to maintain your system through some sort of chemical energy in terms of metabolism of what nutrients or energy sources you're using. When we look at this simple life, we're experimental results, and this just happens in hot springs and in different environments. We see these microspheres that can develop. They form spontaneously, they grow, they divide. It's a random. So one thing these microspheres show us is that living versus non-living distinction is sort of difficult, and life passed through these prebiotic stages. And one of the stages was this developing some membrane, some compartmentalization of those organic or really nucleic acids is what we're looking at in some membrane. And recent work has suggested that maybe some of these liposomes, which are little membrane bubbles that can trap some of these organic compounds. Again, these are also forming spontaneously. Lipid membrane may have formed on a clay surface and captured these biotic molecules. Right, so looking at this chart here, we saw with the prebiotic chemistry, this is the so-called chemicals in that primordial soup. And so we have the carbon dioxide, hydrogen, water molecules, methane, CH4, ammonia, probably some sulfur dioxide and some hydrogen sulfide involved in here. And remember, the other thing that's occurring here is we have some sort of external energy source like a cosmic ray, a lightning strike, some sort of maybe electrical gradient that can catalyze reactions to build simple monomers, and eventually they can join to form these polymers and these nuclides and start forming simple pre-RNA molecules. In a moment we'll talk about how the early world was probably this RNA world dominated by RNA. What we do find about RNA is that RNA can replicate itself, and that's a key. It's being replicated because DNA does that, but RNA is sort of this messenger that's transcribed and will lead to building proteins. But it looks like RNA can also replicate itself, and RNA can also, given conditions like this Archean time where there's no oxygen, higher temperatures, there's all these excess volatiles, RNA is capable of folding and bending, and that's what proteins do. So RNA was sort of instrumental in this early evolutionary history. Then we go into developing DNA. And so DNA develops from RNA, and now we get the DNA protein world. So this is kind of what we're leading to modern cells, prokaryotic cells, and eventually eukaryotic cells. And then here this term LUCA really is the first primordial cell. And LUCA stands for the last universal common ancestor. So this would be the last common ancestor for all living things on Earth. So how did life first originate? So you need some abiogenesis process. And then for this to happen, you need a source of these organic molecules, and you need some energy source. And so obviously the organic molecules are carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. So essentially those 6 are the elements of life. And then in terms of the energy source, the sun, maybe hot springs, mid-oceanic ridges, those hydrothermal vents, or some sort of chemical reactions. So the energy from lightning, volcanism, ultraviolet radiation, so these promote chemical reactions. We have those organic or those elements of life. And again, we're forming those monomers that form spontaneously. Amino acids are simple monomers. Eventually, those monomers build together to make more complex polymers, or these peptides, which are longer chains of amino acids. So back in the 1950s, Stanley Miller and his advisor Urey conducted an experiment where they took some of these early gases that were believed to be in the early atmosphere, combined it with water. Then they added some electrical charge, like a cosmic ray or some sort of lightning strike. They let this run for a while, and in their apparatus, they ended up with simple amino acids. And then we talked about how RNA could have been the initial catalyst for replication and eventually leading to DNA. And the heat source, well, today most scientists are thinking that life probably started at these hydrothermal vents at mid-oceanic ridges and black smokers. So here's a picture of Stanley Miller replicating his experiment. So polymers, proteins, nucleic acids. Monomers linked in specific sequences are these proteinoids, or these thermal proteins. And thermal proteins can replicate themselves, can form spontaneously. And remember we talked about how RNA can replicate itself. So that was probably the initial proteinoids. We're developing these simple replicating RNA molecules that eventually will lead to this DNA world. And then in 2018, last year, there was a study that identifies some of these ancestors of RNA. In fact, these authors from, I think it was the University in Georgia, they actually figured out some simple polymers and monomers that led to the molecules that go into RNA. And so remember, RNA, it has a guanine, adenine, it has cytosine, but instead of having thymine like DNA, RNA has uracil. And so there was a change that eventually led to DNA and thymine. But for anyhow, these guys have determined these early ancestors, and again, based on the temperatures, the lack of oxygen, the reduced iron, the thermal gradients of this Archean world, you can develop these simple pre-RNA molecules. And again, like I said, black smokers, right? So, here they discharge water that's saturated in these minerals. So when you see videos of these black smokers, they look like smoke, but these are actually hydrogen sulfide and metallic sulfide minerals that precipitate in the cold water. So it's not really smoke, it's more of this plume of minerals in the water. So life may have formed near these in the past. So there's a heat source, there's a thermal energy source right there. And so another place is our mid-oceanic ridges. So the Archean time, remember, it was all pretty much oceanic crust. So we're seeing lots of these mid-oceanic ridges. And then I talked about the apex shirt and the oldest fossils. And one thing these guys show is that they were photosynthetic. So certainly by about 3.5 billion years ago, we're starting to see organisms that are true prokaryotic cell and that can do photosynthesis. Some of the oldest fossils that occur in groups are these fossils called stromatolites, which are algal mats interspersed with sediment, usually growing in hypersaline waters, so waters 50, 60 parts per thousand. Remember, the ocean is only about 35 parts per thousand. So this means bacteria or other organisms won't come in there and eat them so they can survive. But these algal mats are alternating layers of organic rich and organic poor sediment. The organic rich sediment is this cyanobacteria, and cyanobacteria, previously called blue-green algae, is photosynthetic. And so here's another view of these stromatolites and how they're forming in these layers. The oldest known true undisputed stromatolites are from South Africa. They date back to 3 billion years old, although there's a group here in Australia that can date back to 3.3 to 3.5 billion years old.